If you enjoyed these curiosities and secrets of the Middle Ages and the Scandinavians, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us from which city you are watching. We still have many stories, mysteries, and legends to explore together. Today, we shall explore one of the most fascinating mysteries of everyday European history, how people of the Middle Ages managed to survive the freezing nights without the resources we today consider indispensable. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. The sun disappears on the horizon of the European village of the 14th century. The last golden lights abandon the cultivated fields, and the houses of wood and stone begin to plunge into darkness. There are no switches to turn on. There are no thermostats to adjust. The cold begins to penetrate through the cracks of the walls, through the windows devoid of glass, through the thatched roofs that barely manage to retain the heat of the day. It is the beginning of a long winter night, and the inhabitants of this village prepare themselves to face a challenge that will repeat itself for centuries: surviving the cold while they sleep. This is a story about human ingenuity, about adaptation, and about customs so distant from ours that they seem to belong to another world. Because sleeping in the Middle Ages was not simply lying down in a bed and closing one's eyes. It was a complex ritual, a strategy of survival, and surprisingly, a deeply communal activity. To truly understand how medieval people faced the nocturnal cold, we must first understand the climatic context that shaped their existence. During a large part of the Middle Ages, Europe benefited from the so-called medieval warm period, a period of relatively mild temperatures that extended approximately from the 7th century to the 13th century. This favorable climate allowed agricultural expansions, population growth, and even the Viking colonization of Greenland. However, around the beginning of the 14th century, something began to change. Historical records document torrential rains that flooded the continent between 1314 and 1316, destroying harvests and provoking devastating famines. It was the prelude to a phenomenon that historians and climatologists would come to name the Little Ice Age. This period of regional cooling, particularly intense in the North Atlantic region, extended from the beginning of the 14th century until the middle of the 19th century. Its effects were dramatic and transformative. In the Northern Hemisphere, average temperatures dropped about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius in comparison with current values. It may seem an insignificant difference, but its consequences were profound. Winters became longer and more rigorous, with temperatures that remained low far beyond the 3 months of the astronomical season. Snow and ice persisted upon the ground during prolonged periods, and summers were frequently short, humid, and insufficient to guarantee abundant harvests. The testimonies of the epoch are eloquent. The River Thames in London froze completely, at least 18 times between the 15th and 19th centuries, a phenomenon that has not repeated itself since 1963. The Dutch canals transformed regularly into natural skating rinks, where winter fairs and festivals were held. In Spain, the River Ebro froze at least 7 times between 1505 and 1789, on some occasions remaining frozen for 15 consecutive days. In Turkey, the very Golden Horn of the Bosphorus froze in 1622. In 1658, an audacious Swedish army crossed on foot the frozen straits of the Belt to surprise the Danish enemy. Diaries of the epoch relate scenes almost unbelievable. The sap of the firewood that burned in the fireplaces froze, inkwells solidified during the night, making writing impossible at dawn. It is in this context of extreme cold that we must situate our investigation into medieval sleeping habits. And the first observation is surprising. The houses of the epoch offered little protection against the freezing temperatures. Medieval dwellings, especially those of the working classes, were frequently built of wood and presented extremely deficient thermal insulation. Drafts of air permanently traversed the interiors, infiltrating through every crack and every poorly sealed joint. The Italian historian Nuissia Raridi, specialized in historical dissemination regarding the Middle Ages, describes these dwellings as spaces where families were forced to choose between letting in the light and the cold, or having neither of the two. The question of windows illustrates this dilemma perfectly. Windows existed, certainly, but they were typically small and devoid of glass. This material, which today we consider banal, was a luxury reserved for cathedrals and palaces. Glass for windows only appeared in religious buildings around the 10th century, and even then it was extremely expensive. Before that innovation, and for a long time after, some churches utilized thin sheets of basalt or other translucent materials to try to resolve the problem of illumination without completely sacrificing thermal protection. In private houses, especially in the most modest ones, glass remained inaccessible for centuries. Only after 1300, when manufacturing techniques improved and the cold began to intensify, did glass windows begin to appear in wealthier residences. And as for heating, the answer reveals another surprising reality. Fireplaces, as we understand them today, with their smoke ducts that direct gases to the exterior, did not develop before the 13th century. According to historical documentation gathered by researchers, this technological advance probably had Italian origin, with the first written references coming from documents of the ancient maritime Republic of Venice. In Spain, the first fireplaces appeared in the Kingdom of Castile during the 13th century, and their use became generalized in the 14th century. Before this innovation, the situation was considerably more primitive. To warm themselves and cook, families lit bonfires directly in the center of the dwelling. The smoke that was released completely filled the interiors and escaped where it could, frequently through holes in the roof or simply through the cracks of the walls and doors. The consequences for the respiratory health of the inhabitants are easy to imagine. Even when fireplaces with smoke ducts became more common, they presented significant limitations. To receive their heat, it was necessary to remain very close to the fire. The vast halls of castles and rural dwellings remained frozen in the farthest corners. Furthermore, these fireplaces were extremely inefficient in terms of firewood consumption. Enormous quantities of wood were necessary not only for the fireplaces, but also for the kitchens, workshops, ovens, and bonfires distributed throughout all dependencies. This voracious consumption of fuel devastated European forests in a few decades, transforming the search for firewood into a constant source of conflicts and profoundly altering the landscape of the continent. A crucial aspect that we must understand is that keeping the fire lit during the night was extremely dangerous. The construction materials, predominantly wood and straw, turned any uncontrolled flame into a catastrophic threat. For this reason, the fire was typically extinguished or reduced to minimal embers before the family retired to sleep. This meant that precisely during the long nocturnal hours, when temperatures reached their lowest values, the houses remained without any source of active heat. The solution to this problem had to be found elsewhere, in the bed itself. The medieval bed was not simply a piece of furniture where one slept. It was a true refuge, a structure conceived to maximize the retention of body heat and protect its occupants from the freezing temperatures that dominated the interiors during the night. And here we find one of the most surprising revelations of this investigation. For centuries, many Europeans slept inside structures similar to cupboards. These closed beds, known as box beds or closed beds, were extraordinarily popular throughout Europe from the medieval epoch until the beginning of the 20th century. Their design was ingeniously simple. They consisted of wooden boxes equipped with doors or curtains that could be completely closed from the inside, creating an isolated microspace within the larger dwelling. The specimen preserved in the Museum of Wick, in the extreme north of Scotland, offers a perfect illustration of this type of furniture. At first glance, with its two double doors of full height on the front and some trunks piled on top, it could easily be confused with a modern wardrobe. The piece is assembled like any piece of conventional furniture, with the parts fitting into one another, which allowed it to be disassembled and rebuilt easily when necessary. However, upon opening the doors, one does not find hangers nor shelves. The interior is empty, prepared to welcome a mattress and its occupants. These closed beds served multiple purposes beyond thermal protection. They offered privacy in a world where private space was practically non-existent. They protected against insects, fleas, and bedbugs, creating a physical barrier between the sleepers and the pests that infested medieval interiors. And, Crucially, they protected against the drafts of air that incessantly traversed the poorly insulated dwellings. The simplest models were little more than rudimentary wooden containers, while those destined for wealthier families could be richly decorated with painted panels or carvings of high artistic quality. Some were built upon legs to avoid the humidity of the ground, while others were built directly into the walls, becoming a structural part of the dwelling itself. But these box beds were not conceived for a single occupant. The larger cupboards could accommodate an entire family, despite the evident discomfort and the risk of asphyxiation when too many people crowded into the closed space. A French story from the 13th century relates the tragic fate of 3 secret guests who died asphyxiated inside a box bed with poor ventilation. Some of these beds were equipped with orifices to allow air circulation, but the danger remained real when the space was occupied beyond its capacity. The key to understanding the popularity of these closed beds resides in the climatic context that we have already explored. During the Little Ice Age, with its especially hard and prolonged winters, this type of structure proved itself extraordinarily useful. In the absence of adequate heating and efficient thermal insulation, the bed converted itself into the only truly warm refuge available during the night. The wooden walls retained the body heat of the occupants, and the closed doors or curtains prevented its dissipation. It was an ingenious solution to a problem that seemed insoluble with the technology of the epoch. However, closed beds were not the only strategy employed to combat the nocturnal cold. Wealthier families disposed of an additional resource: canopy beds. Contrary to what we might suppose, these elaborate pieces of furniture, with their elevated wooden structures and hanging curtains, were not primarily a symbol of status or an aesthetic whim. They were extremely practical. The curtains that surrounded the bed served to retain body heat and protect the occupants from the cold and drafts of air. The wooden structure created a small compartment within the larger room, functioning according to the same principle as the box beds, although in a less hermetic manner. It was not a question of luxury, it was a question of survival. Sleeping clothing techniques also reveal the seriousness with which medievals viewed the challenge of the nocturnal cold. People lay down dressed in multiple layers of clothing and covered themselves with heavy blankets. But a particularly curious detail was the generalized use of caps or hoods during sleep. The head is one of the zones of the human body that loses the most heat, and medieval inhabitants were fully aware of this fact, even without possessing formal scientific knowledge about thermoregulation. Aristocrats used special caps conceived specifically for sleeping, and this practice was perfectly justified. The temperature in palaces rarely rose above 17 degrees, even with fireplaces in operation. The materials utilized for beds and coverings varied significantly according to social position. The most fortunate slept upon mattresses stuffed with bird feathers, covering themselves with wool blankets of high quality and animal skins. The poorest contented themselves with mattresses of straw or rags, frequently infested with parasites, and covers less effective against the cold. But regardless of social class, the principle was the same: accumulate the maximum layers possible between the body and the freezing air. Another strategy frequently employed, particularly in wealthier residences, was the utilization of thick rugs, heavy curtains, and coarse fabrics on the walls and floors to isolate the dwellings from the exterior cold and humidity. These methods, apparently simple, besides serving as decorative elements in aristocratic environments, were crucial to keep the dwellings minimally tempered. The great tapestries that today we admire in museums and castles were not mere objects of artistic ostentation. They fulfilled an essential practical function by covering the cold stone walls and reducing the entry of freezing air. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of medieval sleeping habits is not the furniture nor the clothing, but rather the sleep pattern itself. Investigations conducted by the historian Roger E. Kirsch of Virginia Tech University in the United States revealed that our medieval ancestors slept in a way radically different from ours. While today we seek to sleep in one stretch for 7 to 8 consecutive hours, in the Middle Ages it was common to practice so-called biphasic sleep, a pattern of rest divided into two distinct phases separated by a period of wakefulness. Ekirch's discovery began almost by chance. In the beginning of the decade of 1990, while investigating in the National Archives of the United Kingdom to write a book about the history of the night, he came across a strange expression in judicial testimonies of the 17th century. A witness referred to his first sleep, a formulation that necessarily implied the existence of a second sleep. Intrigued, Ekirch expanded his research and discovered that this practice was much more generalized and normalized than he had ever imagined. References to first sleep appear in literary works as celebrated as The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, written between 1387 and 1400, and in numerous other documents that span from classical antiquity to the beginning of the 20th century. The biphasic sleep pattern worked approximately thus. People retired to sleep between 9 and 11 at night, lying down on mattresses stuffed according to their means. This first period of sleep, designated as first sleep or major sleep, lasted a few hours, typically until about midnight or 1 in the morning. Then, in a completely natural way and without any type of alarm, people awoke. This awakening was not provoked by noise or other external disturbances. It occurred spontaneously, as part of a circadian rhythm adapted to the living conditions of the epoch. The period of nocturnal wakefulness that followed typically lasted 1 to 2 hours and was utilized for a variety of activities. Some people remained in bed, conversing quietly with their roommates. Others got up to perform domestic tasks, add firewood to the dying fire, check the farm animals, or satisfy physiological needs. This interval was also considered a propitious moment for prayer and reflection. Christians had specific prayers prescribed for this exact period of the night. And surprisingly, it was also a privileged moment for conjugal intimacy. After the first sleep had relieved the tiredness accumulated during a long day of physical labor, couples found in this interval the opportunity for the proximity that the diurnal agitation hindered. After this period of wakefulness, people returned to bed for the second sleep, also called morning sleep or minor sleep, which prolonged itself until dawn or even beyond it. Ekirch's investigations revealed that this pattern of biphasic sleep was not an English or European peculiarity, but a truly global practice in the pre-industrial world. In Italy, it was designated as primo sonno, in France as premier somme. Evidences of this form of sleeping were found in regions as diverse as Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Australia, South America, and the Middle East. A colonial account from 1555 regarding Rio de Janeiro in Brazil describes how the Tupinambá people dined after their first sleep. Ekirch's investigation suggests that biphasic sleep was the dominant form of sleeping for millennia, an ancient pattern inherited from our prehistoric ancestors. The first record he identified dates from the 8th century BC in the Greek epic The Odyssey, while the last evidences of its existence date from the beginning of the 20th century. This discovery poses a fascinating question. If we slept differently from our ancestors for thousands of years, why did we change? The answer is found in the transformations provoked by the Industrial Revolution and by the diffusion of artificial lighting. As gas lamps and subsequently electricity allowed diurnal activities to be prolonged beyond sunset, people began to go to bed progressively later. The time available for nocturnal rest shortened, and the interval of wakefulness between the two periods of sleep was gradually eliminated. Industrial work rhythms, with their fixed schedules and emphasis on continuous productivity, also contributed to this change, forcing workers to condense their rest into a single nocturnal block that did not interfere with labor obligations. By the decade of 1920, all references to the system of biphasic sleep had practically disappeared from everyday language. Curiously, modern scientific experiments suggest that biphasic sleep may be a natural process with a biological basis. In the decade of 1990, psychiatrist Thomas Wehr conducted a study in which he exposed a group of volunteers to a short photo period, keeping them in darkness for 14 hours per day instead of the usual 8. After about 4 weeks, the participants spontaneously developed a biphasic sleep pattern, sleeping first for 4 hours, waking for 1 to 3 hours, and then returning to sleep for another 4 hours. Researchers even recorded an increase in body temperature about 90 minutes before each natural awakening, suggesting that the participants had acquired a circadian rhythm adapted to this particular pattern of sleep and wakefulness. Let us return now to the question we initially posed: how did people sleep in the Middle Ages without freezing to death? The answer, as we have seen, is multifaceted. There existed no single solution, but rather a set of combined strategies that, together, allowed survival during the long winter nights. Closed cupboard-type beds created isolated microspaces where body heat could accumulate. Canopy beds and heavy curtains offered additional protection against drafts of air. Multiple layers of clothing and coverings, including sleeping caps, minimized heat loss. Tapestries and thick fabrics on the walls helped to insulate the dwellings. And crucially, people slept in community. This last point deserves particular attention, for it represents perhaps the strangest aspect of medieval sleeping habits to our modern sensibility. In the Middle Ages, sleeping was a fundamentally collective activity. The majority of people slept in community, frequently crowded into a cozy but uncomfortable mixture of family members, friends, servants, and, in the case of travelers lodged in inns, complete strangers. Beds were considered valuable and scarce goods, and few families could afford the luxury of possessing more than one. They all slept together because there was no alternative, but also because the collective heat of bodies was one of the most effective defenses against the cold. This practice of sleeping in a group obeyed strict social conventions to minimize discomfort and prevent problematic situations. There were designated positions for each member of the household and for eventual guests. Typically, girls slept on the side of the bed closest to the wall, followed by the mother and the father, then by the boys ordered by age, and finally by members who did not belong to the family. Conventions demanded that unnecessary physical contact be avoided and that no one move excessively during the night. In normal circumstances, single men and women not related avoided sharing the same bed, although the scarcity of space frequently forced exceptions. Historical records provide vivid descriptions of this forced intimacy. In Ireland of the early 19th century, observers documented the rigorous arrangement of sleeping positions in rural houses. The eldest daughter next to the wall, farthest from the door, followed by the sisters in descending order of age, then the mother, the father, and the sons, also by order of age. Finally, strangers, were they peddlers, tailors, or beggars, slept at the extreme farthest from the women of the family. This careful arrangement sought to minimize risks and maintain some order in an intrinsically chaotic situation. Sleeping in community was not exclusive to the lower classes. Aristocratic families, although they disposed of more space and resources, also frequently shared their chambers with servants and other members of the household. Married couples slept regularly, accompanied by servants and children. As the historian Barbara Tuchman observed, citing medieval sources, life in that epoch developed collectively in an infinite quantity of groups, orders, associations, and brotherhoods. Never was the human being less alone. Except in the case of hermits and prisoners, isolation was practically unknown. The Great Bed of Ware, built in 1590 and today preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, dramatically illustrates this reality. This extraordinary bed, about 3 meters wide, was conceived to accommodate up to 4 couples simultaneously. Destined for an inn in the town of Ware, in Hertfordshire, it served travellers who spent the night there and were willing to pay to share this exceptional bed. The bed became so famous that it was mentioned by William Shakespeare in his comedy Twelfth Night, written around 1601. Medieval inns and taverns offered even more precarious conditions. Travellers rarely disposed of individual beds. They were expected to share the available space with other guests, regardless of whether they were acquaintances or strangers. Accounts from the 18th century describe situations in which 2 of the founders of the United States, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, had to share a bed in an inn during a journey. According to Adams's diary, the 2 men spent a large part of the night arguing because Adams wanted to close the window and Franklin refused, arguing about the risks of sleeping with recycled air. Franklin eventually prevailed when Adams fell asleep during his arguments about ventilation. This nocturnal intimacy, which today seems strange and uncomfortable to us, also had its advantages. Besides shared warmth, it offered opportunities for socialization in a world where free time was scarce. The historian Ekirch describes how, during the hours of twilight between the two periods of sleep, bedmates could share a level of informality that was difficult to achieve during the day. Conversations flowed more freely in the darkness, secrets were shared, relationships deepened. For couples who managed to manage the logistics of sharing a bed with others, the interval between the two sleeps was also a convenient moment for physical intimacy. It is important to highlight that sleeping conditions varied enormously according to social position. While peasants crowded onto straw mattresses shared with family members, and sometimes with the domestic animals themselves, the nobility disposed of chambers heated by fireplaces, elaborate beds with canopies and curtains, feather mattresses, linen sheets, and fine wool blankets. In castles, chimneys built into the walls, a technical innovation of the 11th century, allowed private chambers to be heated and physically separated the lords from the servants. As the historian Barbara Tuchman observed, no invention contributed more to comfort and refinement than the fireplace, although at the cost of widening the abyss that separated the social classes. Servants continued condemned to the cold of their communal dependencies, without other means to combat the low temperatures other than crowding in a group next to the fire of the kitchens and common spaces. An interesting detail about medieval castles deserves mention. Despite their magnificence, these structures were frequently freezing. Construction in stone, although it offered military protection, was terrible in terms of thermal insulation. The enormous halls were impossible to heat adequately, even with the monumental fireplaces that yawned in the walls. For this reason, the inhabitants of castles passed a large part of the time in their beds, which functioned as the only truly tempered spaces. There are records of aristocrats who received visitors and conducted business without leaving their heated beds. Strategies to combat the cold extended also to architecture. The most important dwellings were frequently situated on the southwest side of constructions, where the greatest number of hours of sun in winter afternoons provided some natural heating. Sleeping rooms were typically small and with low ceilings, not because of space limitations, but because smaller volumes were easier to heat with body heat. Windows, when they existed, were small and strategically positioned. As the centuries advanced and the Little Ice Age reached its maximum intensity during the period known as the Maunder Minimum, between 1645 and 1715, survival techniques against the cold were refined. Cast iron stoves, an innovation of the 15th century that became popularized in the 17th century, began to replace traditional fireplaces in many residences. These new stoves were more efficient, allowing better control of combustion and a more uniform distribution of heat. In 1741, Benjamin Franklin invented a particularly efficient model that allowed the regulation of air entry and fire intensity, representing a significant technological advance. With the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and the social transformations that accompanied it, medieval sleeping habits began to disappear. Gaslighting and subsequently electric lighting allowed diurnal activities to be prolonged, altering circadian rhythms. Industrial work schedules demanded concentrated and predictable sleep. The growing valuation of privacy and personal hygiene made the practice of sleeping in community progressively unacceptable. Doctors of the 19th century classified shared sleep as unhygienic, unnatural, and unhealthy. Families began to abandon the ancient practice of communal sleep, and for almost a century, many couples slept separately, in twin beds. Curiously, some vestiges of the ancient biphasic sleep survive to this day in the culture of the siesta, particularly rooted in Mediterranean countries. Our biological clock still presents a natural reduction of alertness in the middle of the afternoon, the so-called post-lunch slump, which may be an echo of this ancient pattern of rest. Experts suggest that waking naturally at 2 or 3 in the morning, a common complaint of modern insomnia, may in truth be a vestige of the biphasic sleep of our ancestors. Instead of being treated as a medical problem that requires medication, This nocturnal awakening may be a manifestation of an ancestral sleep rhythm that was suppressed but never completely eliminated. Box beds also persisted, for longer than we might suppose. They were particularly common in the United Kingdom and continental Europe until well into the 20th century. An account from 1890 documents a family too large for their one-room house in the Scottish Highlands, which had several of its members sleeping in box beds installed in the barn, among dogs and horses. However, with the improvement of housing conditions, the development of central heating systems, and the growing valuation of private space, these structures progressively fell into disuse. Today, preserved specimens can be found in museums and historic rural houses, silent witnesses of a way of living that disappeared. Looking retrospectively at these medieval practices, it is tempting to feel compassion for our ancestors and thank modern amenities that allow us to sleep comfortably in heated rooms, upon ergonomic mattresses, protected by well-insulated walls and double-glazed windows. And certainly there is much for which we should be grateful. We can sleep without the threat of fire, without parasites huddled at our side, without strangers sharing our intimate space. But this perspective runs the risk of being too simplistic. The inhabitants of the Middle Ages did not view themselves as miserable victims. They developed ingenious solutions to the problems they faced, adapting to the conditions of their time with creativity and resilience. Communal sleep, despite the discomfort it causes us to imagine, provided warmth, security, and opportunities for socialization. Biphasic sleep, far from being a symptom of deprivation, may in truth have been more aligned with our natural biological rhythms than the continuous sleep we practice today. And the intimate relationship with fire, the constant awareness of the seasons and climatic conditions, may have conferred upon medievals a connection with the natural world that we, isolated in our climate-controlled houses, have lost almost completely. There is, evidently, no possible romanticization of the real misery that many faced. Children who died of cold respiratory diseases caused by smoke, plagues that infested beds, the hunger that accompanied the most rigorous winters, all this was terribly real. But recognizing the hardness of these conditions does not prevent us from admiring the human capacity for adaptation and for finding practical solutions to apparently insoluble problems. Our medieval ancestors did not have central heating, but they had beds that closed like boxes to retain heat. They did not have memory foam mattresses, but they knew that sleeping together was warmer than sleeping alone. They did not have alarm clocks, but they developed a sleep pattern that utilized the long winter nights productively. Knowing what we were always helps to expand the imagination regarding how the human being can live. Medieval techniques to face the cold may seem primitive and uncomfortable to us, but they represent ingenious solutions to concrete problems developed over generations by people who did not dispose of the resources we today consider basic. Studying these habits is not only an exercise of historical curiosity, it is also a reminder of the extraordinary adaptability of our species and of the relativity of our notions of comfort and normality. The next time you lie down in your heated bed, in a room with controlled temperature, perhaps you can dedicate a thought to those who, for centuries, faced freezing nights with little more than ingenuity, solidarity, and the determination to survive until the next dawn. And if by chance you wake naturally at 2 or 3 in the morning, do not rush to consider this a problem of insomnia. It may simply be the echo of an ancestral pattern of sleep, a silent message from your medieval ancestors that crosses the centuries to remind you that in times past, it was perfectly normal to wake in the middle of the night, and that there were interesting things to do during those dark hours. The history of medieval sleep teaches us that what we consider natural or inevitable is frequently the result of specific historical conditions and collective choices. The way we sleep today, in a private room, in an individual bed, during a continuous period of 8 hours, is not the way human beings always slept, nor necessarily the most natural way to sleep. It is simply the way that adapted to the conditions of modern industrialized life. Knowing the alternatives of the past does not mean we should return to them, but it widens our horizon of possibilities and enriches our understanding of the human experience in all its diversity. The cold of the medieval night no longer threatens us, but the lessons of creativity, adaptation, and solidarity that our ancestors left us continue to be relevant. In a world that faces growing environmental challenges and in which the certainties of modern comfort may reveal themselves more fragile than we suppose, remembering how humans survived epochs of scarcity and adversity can be more than an exercise of historical curiosity. It can be a source of inspiration and hope. And so, while the sun sets upon our narrative, just as it set upon those medieval villages centuries ago, we are left with a final image. Families gathered around a last ember, preparing themselves for a long night, confident in their capacity to survive until dawn. They did not have the technology we possess, but they had something that at times we lack: the awareness that facing the cold, like facing any adversity, is easier when we do it together. If this journey through the past awakened your curiosity and made you look at history in a new way, if you felt the cold of those medieval nights and the warmth of human ingenuity, then the purpose of this narrative has been fulfilled. There is much more to discover about how our ancestors lived, worked, loved, and dreamed. Each epoch has its secrets, each culture its unique solutions to the universal challenges of human existence. If you wish to continue exploring these lost worlds, to unravel the mysteries of the daily life of other eras, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so as not to miss the next documentary journeys. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most in this story, or telling if you know of any similar tradition that has survived to our days in your region. History lives not only in books and museums, but also in the memories and practices that pass from generation to generation. Your participation enriches this community of those curious about the past. And if this narrative provided you with an hour well spent, consider sharing it with others passionate about history, because knowledge, like heat in medieval nights, is more valuable when shared.